not trilingual session because Antonio can also speak Venetian dialect, apparently, so we will start with Italian part, and then we will move on to the English. So those of you who need headphones, please have them with you. Ministro, siamo molto lieti.
Minister, we are glad to have you here with us. Thank you for finding time to take part in this meeting. We know that you are very busy these days, so thank you for your attention. I hope you can hear me. I can hear you very well. Thank you. We have been discussing today about the non-compete clauses, and the result of our survey confirm that they are present in Italy and that they often involve low-skilled workers, and because workers that for reasons of trade secrecy should not be involved in non-compete clauses. This afternoon we have seen the analysis of surveys carried out in many countries, including Italy, in the presence of obstacles to competition on the labor market. There is an effect on wages and also on the conversion of the shift from temporary to permanent contracts. These non-competition forms tend to depress wages and to make the transformation, the shift from temporary to permanent contracts more difficult. So there are many concerns about these practices and these clauses, and we are very interested in listening to your opinion about this, what you think we should do, and above all, whether we can further widen our monitoring capacities to control this phenomenon. A problem we have recorded in our surveys is that workers very often declare these clauses are in their contracts, but we do not have access to the individual contracts of the workers, so we cannot control whether these clauses comply with the requirements imposed by law. If in data collection about compulsory communications, we might perhaps, through sampling, we might have some examples of individual contracts. This might enable us to monitor more seriously the evolution of this phenomenon. I know you have little time available, so I pass you the floor at once, thanking you again for your presence today here with us. Thank you, Professor. I thank you all for this possibility of discussing a theme that was central, that is to say, the elements that cause distortions to the labor market. An analysis and activity I've carried out in these last few months in a complex political situation that has, however, listed the most relevant issues that bring our country to lag behind as far as the labor market is concerned, and that might cause a growth of inequalities, minimum wage, temporary or precarious contracts, irregular jobs, irregular work conditions. Before turning into into topical subjects, dramatically topical subjects because of inflation that has worsened the conditions for many millions workers, in particular the most fragile workers, we have tried to define the possibility of carrying out some corrective actions. Some of them have succeeded, others have failed for the reasons you are well aware of. And this happened when President Draghi had felt the need to act on the adjustment of contracts. His last measures were in this direction, unfortunately was unable to do so, although this would have marked a reversal in the trend. There might be difficulties, but certainly his measures would enable us to involve all political forces supporting the government of national unity to come to terms with these trends. Unfortunately, you all know that these measures were not approved of because of the events you are well aware of. We had on the table the possibility of widening the application of a minimum wage, applying it to contracts, strengthening the rules regulating contracts, waiting for a widespread consensus among the political parties. We had the possibility of rethinking the way in which we provide incentives to the creation of jobs towards a more numerous amount of permanent contracts. And we have a difficulty in having quality collective bargaining. Things went, as you know, the package of measures failed its journey, its approval. And I'm saying this because, first of all, I'd like to stress the importance of the distortions on the labor market for my mandate. And this brings me to appreciate the analysis and the dialogue you have developed today. Second, I would like to stress that something we still have to work on would certainly deserve more attention by the general public in the country and by the politicians in the country. Monopsony power by some firms, the concentration of the labor market, is one of the themes that was least examined in the public debate when dealing with the labor market. And it is not less relevant because of this. We should stimulate commentators and experts to face this, because the attention is not sufficient to this. And even less analyzed is the non-compete clause, the problem of non-compete clauses. There is no awareness of the effects that may have an effect on the contracting power, of the bargaining power of the workers. I think it is important to stress that these distortions in the labor market go beyond pirate contracts and the precarious nature of labor contracts. They might take up even more tricky forms. The need to quantify these situations and for the ordinary citizen to better understand the power in the contracting, the bargaining, collective bargaining, but also on the difficulty to transform into fact the existing possibilities for the labor market. I think we should focus on these themes. Your analysis has a remarkable added value, and carrying out a transnational research project and materializing the theory of this problem can certainly support our efforts. The monopsony power or the concentration of the labor market is influenced by exogenous variables and has an impact on wage levels and contract prerequisites. It is a theme that will have to be dealt with. The proposals you have suggested, the strengthening of antitrust policies or a stronger control on mergers and acquisitions, are extremely important for the public debate. I think they might provide us with a chance to promote more intense monitoring activities. In this sense, your request for more detailed compulsory communications might be a key for us to collect data in order to monitor this phenomenon and to increase the awareness of the workers. If we give the weakest workers the necessary tools, will they be able to reverse the trend? Workers themselves should demand for the possibility to find fairer solutions. We have made a step forward, an important step forward, by receiving the directive on accountability and transparency for labor organization, as it requires a number of obligations and tools to make contracts easily identifiable. Workers are not fully aware of the contracts they sign, especially if they come from other countries when they have difficulties in interpreting not only the contract but also the language. We have been working on the receiving of this directive to strengthen the role of cultural mediators in some sectors, because we are convinced that also for the least qualified jobs, this tool is used with a violent approach against workers. And the same can be said for non-compete contracts or clauses. In the report we have heard today, we realize we have underestimated their importance in the country. You have stressed how many workers are directly or indirectly subjected to non-compete clauses. And it is interesting that there is a large number of workers who passively accept these clauses because they are convinced they have no negotiating power against them, although those clauses are inapplicable according to the legal provisions in force. So it is important to strengthen the representatives of the worker to solve the problems deriving from the lack of trust in the collective bargaining procedure, and to face the fragmentation of the representation for the workers, which has a negative impact also in this sense. I think it is urgent for all of us, not only for us politicians, but also for the academy, to try and interpret this analysis, creating the necessary synergies in order to face all the problems related to the labor market, and that might cause to inequalities and social divisions. We have to increase the collective awareness about the proposals that are strictly connected to the quality of our working life. This type of approach is vital for democracy to avoid. I will not mention what measures we might adopt not to perturbate the electoral campaign, but I think it is important to analyze wage levels, the use of non-compete clauses, and above all, I think we should support the debate on wage levels and collective bargaining involving the whole country to have it progress in terms of individual rights. I think that different opinions on these themes are particularly important, and I want to thank Professor Boeri because he's organizing this kind of debates quite often and fully independently. He is trying to keep the public debate focused on the connections existing among different themes. You cannot face the quality of the working environment only referring to contracts or representation. We have individual themes emerging every now and then, but there is a lack of coordination among the different problems that, interacting among themselves, have an impact on a correct functioning of the labor market. You are contributing today to force politics to come to terms with these problems. I am fully available in the remaining months, in the remaining days, weeks of my mandate to focus on this problem, including it in the database that might support our actions for the future. We are monitoring the implementation of the measures receiving the directive I was referring to. I think that facing these problems, we are really discussing democracy, the quality of democracy, as it is clear that scarce quality work, unskilled work, illegal work are the breeding ground for a lack of confidence in democracy and institutions, and in participative democracy above all. So it is a two-faced problem, in lack of justice, lack of fairness, and a limitation for the freedom we have conquered because of a deep lack of comfort in facing this issue. So allow me to thank you all, wishing you a fruitful meeting and apologizing again for not being there in person. But I guarantee that we have the largest possible attention for the problems you are discussing. Thank you. Thank you, Minister, for your attention, for your remarks, for your reference to the directive on transparency, for your interest in exploring this possibility of monitoring the implementation of the directive itself by collecting individual contracts, analyzing individual contracts, and for your reference to collective bargaining. And at this point, I'd like to introduce the second speaker in our roundtable. I know, Minister, that you have a busy agenda. We are happy to have you with us, but we'll understand whether you have to leave and to abandon our meeting. I would like now to welcome Gianna Fracassi, Deputy Secretary General of CGIL, one of the most important trade unions in Italy. We have mentioned today the role of the trade unions in trying to reduce the contracting power, the negotiating power of the employers. Also because so far in Italy, collective bargaining do not mention the problem of non-compete clauses. We wonder whether the trade unions are reflecting on this, are facing this problem, and what are the ideas you have drawn from our discussion of the morning and of the afternoon. And thank you again for being here with us for the whole day.
Good morning or good afternoon. I hope you can hear me. I have been listening to your proceedings since this morning, and undoubtedly it has been a very interesting discussion. In particular, I would like to highlight this morning's discussion, as you yourself recalled, the non-compete clauses, which are so important in the labour market. The idea that underlies the fact that the association with greater bargaining power, I share up to a certain extent, but I would like to add to the discussion, and I know that this is a last panel, but I think it is also only fair to add some perplexities I have on the issue, and I would like to talk of bargaining in addition to some of the things that were mentioned by Minister Orlando. To answer your question, indeed it is true that collective agreements do not govern this framework. Your assessment and my assessment made in view of this very important meeting, and unless I have missed something, there is no intervention. Even those that focus on high qualification levels. The fact that the non-competes are governed by Article 2225 of the Civil Code has partly inhibited its presence in the contract. Another item I was reflecting upon this morning, the same article, and you recalled a number of criteria that can identify the clauses as being null. However, there is also a compensation envisaged for the worker for the recommencement of their work activities. This aspect is not regulated by collective contract. There are some positions where it was put forward in some very delicate areas, and I'm thinking of the credit segment, but directly with relations and in relations with large groups, and I'm thinking of Leonardo for the mechanical area. But there's no need to beat about the bush and say that, in fact, it was not part of any bargaining procedure. Of course, I'm answering your requests and the ideas that have emerged today, thinking of the prospects and the quality of work, thinking of the increase of qualifications and skills that will characterize the work of the future. I think that this is a very strong item that must be placed at the center of all our contractual platforms, and that must also be faced in terms of organization. For this reason, and I'm not saying this just because I have asked to comment on this, even from the discussions this morning. It appears that the report that was presented today is just a starting point for further in-depth assessment. I am, of course, absolutely available, and my organization is available to follow up this type of work in order for it to be more effective. Because there is a very important landscape, and thinking of the different policies that have been put forward, and I will just mention one associated to transparency and the awareness of these clauses by workers. It's rather serious, the position of things as they stand today, and this has been highlighted by your report. So it's important to work also with workers. Now, I have some question marks, and I would like to put forward some ideas that have also been discussed in the afternoon. The specifics of the Italian markets and the distortions that are there in terms of salaries and quality. It is true that it is not necessary to focus on salaries alone, which are, of course, important, but to also focus on the quality of work. However, I'm not sure that all of this is ascribable to bargaining alone. I think that it is associated to a number of policies that have led to the devaluation, if you like, of the role of the labor force. If we look at the data on the number of people in employment in this country, there are several items to be considered that require further reflection as far as we are concerned. Number one, work conditions in Italy are associated to numerical and also to quality factors. Employment peaks reach 23 million people employed. This is a figure that has been maintained over the years. We have reached a peak this year, which was reached in 2019 and 2008, if I am not mistaken. However, this figure continues to show a divergence vis-à-vis the European average. We are several percentage points below that average. If we take Germany as a reference, we are 15 points below. The thoughts that have been put forward today are very important, therefore. Another reflection, facing these 23 million people in employment, we have 24. Now we have a dramatic reduction of the number of people in long-term permanent contracts. So the issue of lack of continuity is a very serious item in our country. And by the way, there is one issue that has to be remembered. The precarious workers, there's let's say, there are bubbles which are created, arising very often from increases in the economy. And then we had the dramatic drop during the pandemic. So within this framework, the precariousness of employment focuses on an area that we have been investigating, where there is what we have called occupational unease. So we focus on stable contracts, involuntary part-time, involuntary fixed-term contracts. We almost have a record of such contracts. Involuntary part-time contracts often hide a grey area, which is very much present. Let's say, the grey work and the black work. and those who are who are benefiting of the national furlough system. So, to say, these are two areas that if we put them together, we are talking of approximately 9 million potential workers who are vulnerable. Another element, this trait, this characteristic of our labor market has direct consequences on issues associated to salaries, which which has been part of the public debate. We have recently lost trace of such a debate, but it is so interesting because of its consequences in terms of the workers' conditions and their impoverishment. We have a large number of workers who are really almost at the poverty level. What I'm trying to say is that it is a potential area of investigation. It is very complex. It possibly reinforces monopsony. So the the characteristics of the Italian market as enhanced in your documents. There is the requirement, the need to reduce these effects, and it is important to focus on bringing out grey and black labor and to improve employment. And I'm thinking of the Recovery and Resilience Plan. Direct consequences on salaries, which is associated to the trends of our economy, but also to the fact that we're talking about high percentages of involuntary part-times, a discontinuity. This means that these two issues are closely connected. And when we talk of the reinforcement of tools, bargaining is an important part. We have some experimentation performed on the transformation of non-fixed contracts on some platforms, but we need some general policy measures. Bargaining in our country has a very important role as an element that goes against the concentrations. In the previous panel, there was a question which was, in fact, for me. Collective bargaining is an element that can be positive vis-à-vis the concentration of the labor market and vis-à-vis monopsony. It is extraordinary, an extraordinary tool, especially for the more vulnerable and dispersed segment. This also explains the data that was presented for the United States. From a contractual point of view, there are weaknesses and some voids also, and it is understandable why that the debate on these issues is much stronger in the United States. So reinforcing bargaining is one of the most important tools to re-establish a balance in the market, in the labor market, and to work against concentrations. What can we do? To my mind, it is important to intervene on the regulatory framework, the representation of both employers and employees. And of course, I'm drawing to a conclusion. This was a very, let's say, if you like, shallow assessment. We are in a condition where most workers in our country, IMS calculates 96 contracts for 92% of the workers. Our figures are a bit broader, but the collective bargaining has had this very important role. There is a problem, however, because there's a part of the national contracts that do dumping activities on salaries. So the representation of employers and employees is important to reinforce not only bargaining, but also representation, and can therefore become a determinant element. The third issue, now we have a debate on the European regulation. You very much spoke of the minimum salary. On this topic, I will say things that the Minister briefly touched upon. We are open to start a discussion on this topic. We have declared that we are available to do so within a dimension that does not bring us back down. So negotiations that consider the overall economic situation determined in national contracts are signed by the main trade unions, or most representative trade unions, to finally implement this type of contract as envisaged also in our constitution. And then there are some fiscal issues. And then there's another issue which is very important, and which I would like to present as a very important element to contrast concentration, which is training. This associated to work hours. On this we have worked a little bit more. I'm thinking of the contract of mechanics, of the contracts that were signed just a while ago, training and the enforcement of continuous training are issues that are indeed forms of contrast. I'm talking not only for the current situation as a means for defense, thinking of the obliged conversions that will be required by the digital transformation in Italy, but also in view of the future with the possible growth in labour, thinking that this is a very important element as a result of the major economic transformation that our country will be affected by. Thank you, Gianna Fracassi, for this speech and for the attention that you are following our proceedings, and also for the trade unions' commitment and willingness to intervene on these issues. And also in promoting greater awareness amongst the workers on the presence of these contractual clauses, where I think that the trade unions have a major role, because workers trust the trade unions. It is the latter that can better encourage the workers to carefully consider the presence of these clauses in contracts. So the commitment expressed by the Minister, the assessment of whether within the collection of information amongst for mandatory communications there can be a monitoring of individual contracts. This might also be a way for the trade unions to be reassured as to the fact that employers do not add in the contract clauses that the worker is not aware of. I think there is much to do, and we, of course, are here available to provide you with our support. So thank you once again.
English, and it's a great pleasure for me to give the floor to Sofia Rodrigues. This morning and this afternoon, competition authorities, antitrust commission have been repeatedly called into action as being a very important actor in intervening on and counteracting monopsony power. Your authority, thanks also to your work as a chief economist, has been, the Portuguese authority has been, pivotal and pioneering in terms of intervening on these issues. The other authorities in Europe are somewhat reluctant to address issues concerning market power in the labor market, as they consider this as not being so relevant for their actions. So clearly we are very much interested in having your views, your experience, and your suggestion also for the way we can also in other countries promote a similar involvement of antitrust authorities in this debate.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to be in this interesting event. I've learned so much in the previous panels. Being a competition enforcer, I will try to provide a brief snapshot of where do we come from in terms of competition policy in labor markets, where do we stand today, and what can we expect from the future. I think it is fair to say that these past years, these recent years, there has been an increased focus of the competition community in the topic of labor markets and competition issues in labor markets. A few years ago, I think it is also fair to say that this was already a topic in the US, most preeminently in 2016, the US antitrust agencies, the DOJ and the FTC, took a joint statement informing that they would criminally prosecute no-poach and wage-fixing agreements as per se infringements to the Sherman Act. In Europe, however, things have been less dealt with, but I think this is changing. It's changing because, for example, just at the end of last year, Vice President Margaret Vestager has announced that no-poach agreements are under the Commission's radar. Up to now, there's no decisional practice at the Commission level regarding no-poach agreements. There are some decisions by member states regarding no-poach, but always, up to now, or up to recently, always not cases of naked no-poach agreements, but rather no-poach agreements in the context of wider cartel agreements, so in which firms were agreeing not only, for example, in terms of wages, but also on other dimensions of competition, such as prices, so wider cartels. Now, there are several developments that have contributed to this increased interest of the competition community in competition in labor markets. Certainly, the empirical studies that have been mentioned today, for example, by Author and Barkai, that have identified the increase in concentration as one of the potential factors explaining the trend of decreasing share of labor in GDP was a relevant development. Also, the empirical studies that documented or shown or found a negative relationship between concentration and the level of wages, to which many of the speakers that have spoken in previous sessions has contributed. Those developments, I think, were quite influential in putting this topic in the spotlight for the competition community. Now, at the Portuguese Competition Authority, we follow these developments very carefully. We've also saw the famous Silicon Valley case of a no-poach agreement that was, as I said, very high-profile case that brought a lot of attention to the topic. And just here a side note also to detail how these things happen. And in the case of the Silicon Valley no-poach agreement, firms were actually circulating lists with the names of the employees that were covered by the no-poach agreements amongst the HR departments in the firms that were involved in this collusive practice. So this was another relevant development. At the Portuguese Competition Authority, a few years back, we started having the clear perception that there was under-enforcement in this area, that there were agreements in labor markets amongst firms that infringe the Portuguese Competition Act and that were going under our radar. And this was a concern for us, and more so in a time of in which governments were all committing efforts to the economic recovery. And we think that in times of economic distress, it's even more important to ensure that workers are not deprived from the opportunities that open and competitive markets can offer to them. So this was a further policy motivation for us to strengthen our detection and our enforcement in this area. So we tried to develop a strategy to foster detection. It's important to realize that there are only a few, these are secretive agreements, And agencies, competition agencies, need to focus on the instruments that they have to detect these type of infringements. You can have complaints, you can have leniency applications in which the offenders, the infringers, confess to the competition agency that they have engaged in this type of agreements. And then you have ex officio, in which competition authorities proactively try to find indicia of this type of infringement. So what we decided to do a few years back was to engage in a strong advocacy initiative. We started developing a report that delves into explaining what are no-poach and wage-fixing agreements, what their effects are, not only in labor markets, which is something that is very often discussed, the impact in workers, but also in the efficient functioning of markets, the competitive functioning of markets, and at the end of the day, for consumers. So we thought it was very important to communicate these effects. We did this in this report that was highly participated. We had a public consultation in which we gathered the views of stakeholders such as workers' representatives, consumer associations, business associations, and firms in general. And last year we published this report. So there, we not only explain what these agreements are. So when you're speaking about no-poach agreements, you are covering agreements not to cold call each other's workers, but also agreements not to hire each other's workers, and wage-fixing agreements, which obviously involve some concerted action that can align the level of wages. And here it's important to know that it's not only price fixing, but also exchanging sensitive information that can contribute to alignment of prices. I think Ioana Marinescu has mentioned how exchanging sensitive information might also be liable to be a competition infringement. Also here a side note regarding the current context of inflation. One of the things that we are trying to be very aware of is of agreements between firms in order to avoid passing to wages the increase in inflation. So you can imagine, for example, competitors agreeing that they're not going to poach each other's workers, or that they're not going to increase the wages of their workers as a result of inflation. And obviously this is quite distressing just to imagine the consequences of this type of agreements. Now, in the issues paper that we published, we discuss the effects in labor markets, how they reduce mobility, how they allow firms to distort price signals and reduce the level of wages below that would result in a competitive market, how they can affect or lead to allocative inefficiency, for example, by overextending the time that a worker spends in a firm that might not be the most adequate use for their skill set, how they can lead to a reduction of the supply of labor in a given market. For example, if outside alternatives become relatively more attractive because of the no-poach or the wage-fixing agreements. But we also discussed the implications in downstream markets. For example, how by reducing the level of wages and by reducing the supply of labor, you can have a reduction in the quantity or the quality of the products supplied downstream. How by reducing worker mobility in industries where this worker mobility is very important for innovation, these agreements might reduce knowledge spillover and thus lead to a reduction in the rate of innovation in the industry, for example. So there are several negative impacts that these agreements might have also for consumers. They can lead to lower quality, less innovation, lower quantity, vis-a-vis a market that was working competitively. It's also important that very often these agreements might also be ancillary to a wider cartel. So, for example, if firms that are competing in a market where client portfolios are very important, if they agree not to poach their workers that have their own client portfolios, you are somehow achieving a result which is market segmentation in terms of clients. So you're basically agreeing not to poach the clients if you agree not to poach the workers that have the client portfolio. This is just an example. We also discuss how this might lead to lower investment from workers in terms of their training. There's a lot of discussion also about the effects on investment, and we've discussed earlier this morning that there are some claims from consultants or firms that engage in this type of agreements that this is a way that they find to protect investment or secrecy. Well, in the issues paper, we take a very clear stance saying that we do not think that this is a proportionate way to deal with these, with issues of investment, that there's other ways that are less restrictive of competition for firms to protect their investment in labor, as for example, having workers repaying their training if they finish the contract, or you can have other retention policies, just for example with bonuses or increasing salaries to the workers that you want to keep in your firm. So this is basically what we did in the issues paper. At the same time, and I think this is very important for a competition policy enforcement perspective. One of the claims that we also have sometimes from firms, and it's actually not unusual to hear that, well, while workers are going to be made worse off by these agreements, consumers will be better because firms are going to spend less with wages. And we make clear that this is not the case because these are not variable costs. Variable costs are passed on through to consumers, to final consumers, but wages in general or typically are fixed costs. So it's unlikely that any savings in terms of wages for firms are going to be passed on to consumers. And thus, this is a crucial element for any type of efficiency argument to be considered by a competition agency. So at the same time that we published the issues paper, we also published best practices that target recruitment agencies, headhunters, people working at HR departments in firms, informing about what these are, these agreements, their effects, informing that if a firm engages in these agreements, they are liable to competition law, the fines that are involved, that in Portugal can go up to 10% of the turnover of the firm, but also 10% of the annual salary of workers that are found to be directly related with the agreement. And we also include a list of do's and don'ts regarding what firms can and cannot do in order to comply with competition law. Now, this is in terms of advocacy and in trying to make sure that we have an awareness and that we have more information being put up forward to the competition agency regarding hints of potential anti-competitive agreements. We have also made important steps in terms of enforcement. Last year, we issued our first decision fining 13 firms, 13 clubs actually, and the Portuguese Football League for a no-poach agreement that was adopted during the pandemic. Basically, clubs agreed not to poach each other's football players that decided to leave the club because of the pandemic. So this was, there were press releases from the Portuguese Football League that we have identified. So this was an ex officio investigation, and we fined the clubs just last year. And this was a naked no-poach agreement case, the first one for the Portuguese Competition Authority. But there are other investigations that are ongoing now. So I think we were successful, or we are hoping to be even more successful in the future in this attempt to strengthen our enforcement in this important area. So in terms of the future, I think that we have very good developments in terms of the attention of the competition community, so I can expect, I think, for the future, more investigations, more decisions, and closing the gap of under-enforcement of competition policy in this important area. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and Sofia, if I may, for your very insightful remarks, your experience, and your also way to answer some of the issues that were raised this morning, question about the interaction between labor and the product market. Also, what you said about the involvement of the Commission and the commitment of Commissioner Vestager is very encouraging, and also your activity and also in enforcement, I think, is something that other countries should really take as blueprint. So thank you once more for this. Now, I think it's the turn of Antonio Spilimbergo, who is, as you know, Deputy Chief Economist at the IMF. I think what we are asking you, Antonio, is, as you know, someone who has indeed broad view and over labor markets, not only in Europe, but also in other countries, and given also your long-standing experience in this, to give us, a broader, view and the big picture, out of what we have been talking about today.
Thank you a lot. It was a fantastic meeting, and I hope to bring home some idea for further research. I will talk about three topics. First, macro consequence of monopsony. Second, how the COVID, and especially in the world post-COVID, will be influenced by how monopsony will be in the world post-COVID. And third, possible remedies. But before starting, let me tell you an analogy that came to mind, especially looking at the blue light there. Nuclear radiation are very difficult to detect, but they are incredibly dangerous. So somehow the labor economists looking around for monopsony remind me of nuclear physicists that at the beginning were trying to find, they always find the effect of the radiation. They never observed them, but still the radiation were killing people. So it was, I think it's very interesting, the work, the careful work, there are many signs and so on. But as you know, there is a joke that nuclear radiation are too serious to be left to physicists. And by the same token, I would say monopsony is too serious to be left only to labor economists. And I will try to give some macro spin to this. Why radiation beta monopsony could kill, and what are the effects? Well, I list at least 6 macro consequences on which we have been working also at the fund. First is the effect on labor market share. As you know, has been declining in all countries for many years, and increasing market power is a possible culprit, and it's important, and we have been studied it. Second, related to this, is work on inequality. Inequalities related to this. My colleague Florencio Mott has a very nice paper connecting market power to this, and this has really very big macro implications. Third, underinvestment in human capital. You talk a little bit about this. If you know that you are prisoner. If you are tied to your job, probably you invest less in portable human capital. And so in a world which is rapidly changing, this could be detrimental. So, and it's difficult to evaluate the macro effect, but the fact that it's difficult to measure doesn't mean that it doesn't kill you. Again, it's very important. Fourth, while monopsony and monopoly are really the two sides of the same coin, of companies which are trying to maximize profit, and on product side and on the input side. And so the effect that you have monopoly power could damage or could worsen the situation on the monopoly power, and vice versa, mutually reinforcing. And this is very bad macroeconomically. And this, of course, has an effect which is also on innovation. Actually, historically, so there is less incentive to innovate if you have this. Historically, given that we are in this beautiful city and town, the medieval guilds one of the reasons why there were gigantic monopsony organization, very codified, and where you restricted entry, both in terms of product and in terms of through apprenticeship, you had to go and now we call it monopsony, but in reality, this is, and finally, more exotic, but some colleagues are even studying this now, effect of monetary policy. There is some effect that, as we know, that monopoly could have some effect on monetary policy because the transmission is lower. You could have also some effect on the labor market, which is the key input on, and so this is, so I listed the effect on labor market share, inequality, underinvesting human capital, transmission monetary policy, effect on product market, and effect of innovation. So it's enough to really have a big effect. Now, what happened with the, I appreciate a lot all your effort to measure, to find effectively this market power monopsony, but I think it's very important in the future also will be to find the macro implication and so. Now, how COVID could have affected monopsony? Just not during COVID, but in the world after COVID. Well, I was thinking about 3 channels. One, market concentration. We know that during COVID, a lot of small, medium enterprises left the market, were reduced, large companies were increased their share, and we know that market concentration, as you rightly show, is linked to monopsony. So this is for sure a channel. The second channel is organization work. In the sense now, and this can go to the opposite direction, with the possibility of working from home, basically workers which were before in a very small labor market and now compete in a much broader market. So this goes into the other direction, at least for some kind of work. Finally, which is probably as important, is what we learned during COVID is that different categories of work have different reservation wages. We know that the Great Resignation was especially for some workers. Gender was a big issue, age was a big issue. So, and precisely this segmentation of the labor market make the monopsony power more powerful, could be, because you can target some workers and not the other. So 3 is, it's not clear in which direction we go, but 1, for sure, market power going up will increase monopsony power, potential. The organization of work is more ambiguous, and the segmentation of the labor market after COVID could probably increase also. This brings me back to the issue of what are the possible remedies on this? Because COVID, the world post-COVID has a challenge, but also offers some possibilities. And I think that I would say there are 4 ways of addressing, from a macro point of view, the monopsony. One is for sure addressing monopsony, in the sense that anti-competition authorities, the moment that they address seriously monopoly, they, as a byproduct, many times you have also a monopsony bonus, so to speak, to address. And this is very important, and I think that this. Second is what, again, going back to the analogy of radiation, that they don't see you, you don't see them clearly, information. Information of workers, the role of unions also to inform and so on. Because as I said, it's a very pernicious problem because you don't see it so evidently. It's really like radiation. Third is justice system, which is very, especially in Italy, the certainty of and the follow-up are very important because we know the labor justice is sometimes problematic, even for clear cases. With these cases, it could be even more. So the combination of having a system which is not as efficient as it should be, more on dealing with a topic which is not so clear sometimes. Finally, institutional framework. As I said, with COVID, there is no new possibility with the organization of labor. This could work in relationship, but this offers some possibilities, some pitfalls, and the role of the unions and institutions is very important to make a positive outcome out of it and not just negative. So I hope you didn't get offended by the radiation analogy.
Not at all. Thank you so much for this. It was very useful, and you summarized many of the things, but then added new insights. Very important also what you said about justice, because this morning clearly we were looking at enforcement and the lack of jurisprudence on many of these issues. So I think it's a very, very, very important problem. So I think it was a good way also in a way to close this session. I know that you have certainly questions to be asked, and there are many other things that you would like to discuss with these very two distinguished speakers that we have today with us, but unfortunately time is really getting short, so unless there is really a two-ended question or very, very... So we let him talk. Okay, Andrea. Well, since given the wonderful job you did today in presenting in such a short time, I think you have the right to speak, although I was planning really to close here. If you really want. I think the mic is not working.
Sofia Rodrigues. Okay. Yeah. Did it work? Yeah. Because you were talking about when wage fixing agreement also that to exchange information, it's important and it should be, it's a problem, okay? It should be enforced against. This is of course clear in the US case, but in your country, like in many other European countries, you have sectoral bargaining. So sectoral collective bargaining. So firms, they are obliged to exchange information in preparation of negotiations. So it's really a curiosity. How do you deal with this problem? Because you see in the literature, but this is purely academic, saying that, yeah, there is a way we don't see so much enforcement in Europe, it's because of this. So it would be nice to see your experience and your point of view.
Of course, thank you, and that's a very good question. When you fix wages, that is a clear-cut infringement to competition. When you exchange of information, that is a case by case. It depends on the type of information that we exchange, of course. If you exchange information with your competitors regarding level of wages of your employees, that may amount to an infringement to competition. In our best practices, we make clear, however, that exchanges of information in a social dialogue context, where you have the government, a representative from the workers, and a representative from business associations, you have business associations, in this three-party social dialogue, that does not amount to an infringement to competition. So that is excluded from the application of competition policy because there's a three-party social dialogue going on. So we mentioned that, and this was one of the clarifications that we thought for us was clear in the first version of the guidelines that we put forward for public consultation. There were questions raised on this regard. What can we and what can we not do, or how can we make sure that we comply, and mentioning specifically that, and that's why we clarified it in the guidelines. Thank you.
Antonio, thank you. Thank all the speakers today and all the participants. You know, these conferences have, everybody is an active participant. I think the discussion was, as in previous conferences, very, very important today. I think we have been really a long day, so it's time to rest. I'm also getting a bit anxious about this blue light on the back. No, the only announcement I have to make is that tonight, those of you who are involved in the post-conference program should bring a sweater, because maybe rather cold, so please do so. And well, I think in thanking all of you, there is a person in particular that we should all thank for the wonderful organization of this event, as previous conferences of the Fondazione. You know, we are at the 24th edition, and I think without her contribution, this would have not been possible. And we had also these days a confirmation of the wonderful capacity to organize this event. And this is Roberta Marcaletti, who is sitting there, and I think she needs an applause for this. So, bye-bye.